Do you struggle to sit the canter? Have you really had a hard time getting with your horse and you find you're struggling day in and day out? Well, I'm here to tell you, hip hip hooray, it's a quick tip today. So many riders struggle with having a deep seat, and that's because they don't know their own anatomy. And when they were told crazy things like, you have a collapsed hip, which is anatomically impossible. So I want to show you a bit about your own body so you can understand more about what you have to do in the saddle to have a great ride with your horse. So first of all, let's talk about your pelvis. Your pelvis is a bony structure. It's got the wings of the pelvis, okay, that most people think of as their hips because this is where your belt sits. So they say, oh, here's my hips. They put their hands on their hips and they put them up here. But that's not where the joint is. That's just simply the top of the pelvis, otherwise known as the iliac crest. So it's really not what we're talking about when it comes to riding. What's much more important is that we understand where the hip joints are. These are ball and socket joints. They're really big. They're where the leg meets the pelvis. Okay, so it's the joint where the leg meets the pelvis. And when we're talking about hips, this is what we're talking about. This is what is so crucial. So that's the thing to realize is that it's a joint that we're needing to talk about, not just a spot, not just the top of the pelvis, because there's no joint there. And in riding, it's that hip joint and the movement in that hip joint that's so critical to making your ride really great. So let's dive into where your hips are and how they function. Okay, so there's a really simple exercise you can do in the saddle. And this rider's just, first of all, identifying where her hip joint is. Notice that she slid her hand way in. So many people think that their hip joint is much further out, but it really is way far down in the body, like really close. So we can't actually touch the joint. That's the thing is you can't physically touch the joint. That's anatomically impossible. But you can get the idea of the direction of the joint so that you'll know where the movement needs to happen. So when we look at this picture, you can see that, there's a big tendon that runs up here, and she's gone to the inside of the tendon to feel where the joint movement is. And so this is something that you can do. You can just take your hand and slide it into the crease of your pants and move your leg a little bit left and right, like turning the knee in and out so that you can find the actual hip joint. It's so important that you know where that joint is because this is what's going to make the difference in your riding when you're sitting in the saddle. So in this particular picture, the rider has leaned back. Let's see if I can get these lines out of here. She's leaned back from the hip. So that's what's happening here to open that hip angle. And this is another super misconception. People think that turning your knee out is opening the hip. And that's not. You're not opening that angle. You're simply externally rotating the leg. So it's really important to know that when you take the upper body back or bring your knee to your chest, that's closing or opening your hip angle. So in this particular picture, this rider has leaned back from the hip and she's opened the angle between her body and her thigh. So that angle has increased. She has opened her hip. Okay. In this picture, she's closed her hip. So now she's leaned forward. Notice where her finger is. You can see really clearly that she's pointing way in, and here's the crease of the pants, and so this is where the hip is here. And she's closed the angle between the torso and the thigh. So she's closed her hip angle. And this is just really important, especially if you're jumping, to know how you open the hip and how you close the hip, because you'll hear people scream it all the time, but they don't actually tell you how to do it. Okay, so we're going to go and look at one more picture now. This is in the middle. Her pelvis is upright. You can see that her belt line's nice and straight. Okay, the line of her pants is coming up and angling straight. Here's the crease, and you can see where she's pointing. She's pointing to that joint. So we're just identifying the hip from the front. And this is such a simple thing to do. Just take your hand, right? Just take your hand, follow in the line of the crease of your pants when you're sitting. Take your knee, turn it a little bit left and right, just like this person is doing. She slid her hand in. She's not turning her knee in this particular picture because she's sitting in a saddle, but you can turn your knee a little bit left and right and feel that the joint movement is in here. And so this is going to make such a difference to your riding if you can identify your hip joint and understand that opening and closing the hip is changing the distance between the thigh and the torso. So if you lean back or you let the leg down, you've opened it. And if you bend the knee upward towards your body or lean forward, you've closed the hip. So I hope this Murdoch Minute has really helped, and just make sure that you always enjoy the ride.